Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating intellectual revolutions in macroeconomic history. We're going to explore how Milton Friedman absolutely shattered the economic consensus of the 1960s and in the process completely redefined how we understand inflation, unemployment, and the actual limits of government policy. It's a classic paradigm shift story, you know? It takes us from this world of supreme policy confidence straight into a harsh wake-up call and ultimately leads us to the modern economic models we use today. To really grasp why Friedman changed economic theory forever, we first need to put ourselves in the shoes of a 1960s policymaker. Back then, they were asking a very seductive question. Can we simply choose a permanent mix of low unemployment just by accepting a tiny bit of higher inflation? In the post-war era, governments were incredibly confident that they could manage aggregate demand to perfectly stabilize the economy. They really thought they'd found a magic lever. But, as we're going to see, pulling that lever actually triggered a massive trap.
All right, Section 1, the inflation-unemployment menu.
Okay, let's dive into how this trap was set by looking at the birth of what economists call the Phillips Curve. Starting way back in 1861, you can trace how a fairly simple observation morphed into a hard and fast rule. Economist A.W. Phillips studied nearly a century of data from the UK, from 1861 all the way to 1957. But here's the catch. Phillips didn't actually look at price inflation. He was looking at the relationship between unemployment and the rate of change in money wages. And he noticed a pretty clear historical pattern. When unemployment was low, firms had to compete aggressively for workers. Bargaining power shifted toward labor and wage growth went up. Simple enough, right? When unemployment was high, wage growth slowed down. It was just an empirical regularity. But then, in the 1960s, economists Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow took this wage-setting story, linked it directly to price inflation, and transformed it into a fully operational policy trade-off.
Suddenly, the Phillips curve was being presented as a literal restaurant menu for policymakers. I mean, think about that for a second. Want lower unemployment? No problem. Just order a side of slightly higher inflation from the waiter. It fit that confident, almost hubristic post-war mood perfectly. It really looked like you could permanently stabilize the whole economy just by picking your favorite combo off this menu. But there was a massive, glaring weakness to this early setup. It treated the curve as completely stable and left human expectations entirely out of the picture.
Section 2, Friedman changes the game.
That exact blind spot is where Milton Friedman, alongside Edmund Phelps, struck. In the late 1960s, they completely disrupted this overly confident status quo and literally changed the game. The entire hinge of Friedman's argument comes down to one simple contrast. The old consensus assumed workers only cared about nominal wages, the sheer face value of the cash in their paychecks. But Friedman and Phelps argued that, well, humans are smarter than that. We care about real purchasing power, what actually goes into the grocery cart. So what matters isn't just inflation alone, but inflation relative to what we expect inflation to be. If you get a 5% raise, but you fully expect prices to jump by 5%, your real wage hasn't actually changed at all. Human expectations change absolutely everything about how economic policy plays out in the real world.
And this brings us to a massive concept that Friedman established: the natural rate of unemployment. Simply put, this is the unemployment rate that naturally aligns with the real structural realities of the labor market, things like demographics, the time it takes to find a job, and institutional friction. Now, we should be careful to distinguish this from Nairu, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is more of a specific empirical model. And a quick warning here: this natural rate, it isn't some fixed magic number handed down from the heavens. It's an empirical construct, and there's a lot of real-world uncertainty around it. But the absolutely crucial takeaway is that an economy will naturally gravitate toward this rate, entirely regardless of what inflation is doing.
Section 3, the accelerationist trap.
So what exactly happens when a government tries to force unemployment below that natural rate and workers catch on? Welcome to the accelerationist trap. Let's walk through it. Step 1, the government pumps up demand to push unemployment down. Step 2, because the labor market is running hot, inflation naturally rises. And for a brief, fleeting moment, the policy actually seems to work, mostly because the inflation takes people by surprise. But then comes step 3. Workers and firms aren't foolish. Their expectations adjust upward and they demand higher wages to match that new inflation. Step 4. Since real wages haven't actually improved for employers, hiring slows back down and unemployment snaps right back to the natural rate. Now, if a central bank stubbornly tries to keep unemployment artificially low year after year to fight this, step 5 kicks in. You don't just get higher inflation, you get an incredibly dangerous cycle of continuously accelerating inflation as expectations constantly try to outrun reality.
The harsh reality here is that there is absolutely no free lunch. In the long run, expected inflation inevitably catches up with actual inflation. And that means the Phillips curve isn't some gentle, sloping menu you can just slide along. It becomes a perfectly vertical wall. Unemployment returns to the natural rate, period. Friedman's 1968 paper is the classic, definitive statement on this. Any short-run trade-off you think you see depends purely on people being temporarily fooled, slow adjustments in expectations, or market rigidities.
Section 4. Rebuilding the modern curve.
Now, following Friedman's massive breakthrough and Robert Lucas's later critique that essentially blew up the idea of using simple historical correlations for policy, the economics profession realized they had to adapt. To rebuild the curve, modern economists turned to microfoundations, resulting in the new Keynesian Phillips curve. It assumes monopolistically competitive firms and relies on something called Calvo pricing, which is basically the idea that firms can't all reset their prices at the exact same time. It's staggered. Because a business setting a price today knows they might be stuck with that price for a while, current inflation ends up depending heavily on expected future inflation, along with real marginal costs and unexpected supply shocks. They essentially transformed a backward-looking historical correlation into a much smarter forward-looking equation.
The real beauty of this new Keynesian model is that it explains why the curve acts so differently under different conditions. Think of it like the difference between a block of ice and a tightly coiled spring. If a huge fraction of firms keep their old prices, meaning extreme icy price rigidity, inflation responds very slowly to economic slack. That gives us a flatter short-run curve. But if prices unfreeze and there's less rigidity, the curve acts like a triggered spring. It gets much steeper, and inflation responds aggressively and rapidly to any slack in the economy. The mechanics of how prices are set aren't just nerdy technical details. They fundamentally dictate how quickly policy ripples through the economy and just how painful bringing inflation down is going to be.
Section 5. Lessons for today's economy.
So what does this all mean for us right now? Let's connect these big historical paradigm shifts to our world today, especially when we look at recent surges in global inflation. First off, we've got to clear up a common blur in the data between wages and prices. The wage Phillips curve specifically links wage inflation to slack in the labor market. But the price Phillips curve links price inflation to broader economic output gaps and real marginal costs. During times when energy prices spike, supply chains break down, or import costs go crazy, sound familiar? The price curve can behave completely differently from the wage curve. This brilliantly illustrates why inflation can absolutely skyrocket from supply disruptions, even if a pure labor market overheating story isn't the main driver.
Now, you might hear folks out there saying, oh, the Phillips curve is totally dead, because, well, it's looked pretty flat over the last few decades. But honestly, that's way too crude. It looks flat for very specific structural reasons. For one, we have much better anchored inflation expectations today, backed by highly credible inflation targeting by central banks. And credibility is huge here. When a central bank is credible, people don't just panic and change their long-term expectations at every single little economic shock. Adding globalization, fierce import competition, and shifts in wage-setting institutions, and things stay relatively steady. The modern perspective reminds us that a flat curve doesn't mean economic slack doesn't matter anymore. It usually just means our well-anchored expectations are doing the heavy lifting to keep things stable.
Ultimately, the Phillips curve survives because inflation simply does not float free from real economic activity and human expectations. Milton Friedman permanently taught us that central bank credibility and public expectations are literally everything. If a central bank loses that hard-earned credibility, well, that long-run vertical curve we talked about, it reasserts itself with a vengeance. So looking at the complexities of our modern economy, we're left with a pretty sobering question. If our inflation expectations become truly de-anchored today, will Friedman's accelerationist trap return to haunt us?